When Memory Stopped Belonging to Us, Episode 21. If humanity is more than biology, then memory becomes more than information. Because memory is not only how we remember the past, it's how we understand who we are. And science fiction keep asking a disturbing question. What happens when memory itself can no longer be trusted? This is the Sci-Fi Griot. I'm your host, Nicholas Cunningham. The last episode, we asked what makes someone human. And again, science fiction pointed us toward memory, empathy, connection, moral choice, and identity. But today we move deeper into one of the most unsettling ideas in all of science fiction. What happens when memory stops belonging to us? Not forgetting memory, controlled memory, edited memory, manufactured memory, purchased memory, implanted memory, curated memory. Because science fiction understands something deeply important. Who controls memory controls identity. Not just personal identity, cultural identity, historical identity, and moral identity. And maybe that sounds dramatic, but until you realize how much of your life is already dependent on memory, your relationships, your regrets, your loyalties, your fears, your values, your grief, and your sense of self. Memory tells you the following: who hurt you, who loved you, who mattered, what failed, what must never happen again. Without memory, identity begins dissolving. And science fiction keeps returning to this idea because memory is one of the few things that stands between human beings and manipulation. That's why dystopian futures so often attack memory first, sometimes even directly. A corporation implants memories, a government rewrites history, a machine edits experience, a society erases the uncomfortable past. Other times it happens more quietly. People become distracted, overstimulated, fragmented, emotionally exhausted. The result is the same: a population that no longer remembers clearly become easier to shape. And science fiction understands this. Memory is not passive. Memory resists. To remember suffering is to resist repeating it. To remember dignity is to resist system that reduces people. To remember truth is to resist propaganda. That's why memory matters so much in science fiction. Not because the genre is nostalgic, but because memory protects humanity from becoming endlessly programmable. And maybe that fear feels more relevant now than it ever has before. Because we already live in a world where algorithms shape attention, timelines reshape memory, history is constantly reframed, images outlive context, outrage replaces reflection, and people increasingly outsource remembering to systems. Science fiction saw this tension long before technology caught up, which is why so many of its most powerful stories ask the same question. If your memories can be manipulated, then what remains truly yours? One of the most important memory questions in science fiction come from the film in Blade Runner, especially Rachel. Rachel believes her memories are real. Her childhood, experiences, emotions, and identity. But eventually, she discovers something horrifying. Those memories were implanted, manufactured, borrowed, and suddenly her entire sense of self become unstable. Because memory is not just information. Memory creates continuity. It tells us, I am the same person I was yesterday. Without that continuity, identity begins collapsing. And Blade Runner forces us into a deeply uncomfortable space. If memories shape identity, then does it matter where they were originally formed? Excuse me, where they were organically formed. Rachel's emotions are still real. Her reactions are still real. Her grief is still real, which means the memories may be artificial, but their impact is not. That what makes Blade Runner so philosophical unsettling. It reveals how fragile identity actually is. Many people assume identity is stable, it's fixed or permanent. But science fiction says otherwise. Identity is constructed continuously through memory, through story, through recognition, and even through relationships. And once memory becomes edible, identity becomes vulnerable. Then think about it, in Blade Runner 2049 even pushes this idea even further. Kay becomes obsessed with the possibility that one of his memories may be real. Not because the memory itself changes his functionality, but because authenticity matters. He wants proof that his existence is not entirely artificial. That desire is deeply human. People want their experiences to matter. They want their memories to be theirs. They want their pain to be acknowledged. They want their lives to leave traces. Science fiction again understand this. To manipulate memory is to manipulate meaning itself. In the film Total Recall takes memory in a very different direction. What if memories could be purchased, customized, installed, experienced artificially, say in vacation, adventure, heroism, and identity? At first, it sounds entertaining, even convenient, even harmless, until the central question emerges. If a memory feels real, what makes it less meaningful? And suddenly, science fiction moves into dangerous territory because human beings do not respond emotionally based solely on objective reality. We respond based on perceived experience, which means manufactured experiences can still shape genuine emotion, fear, love, trauma, confidence. And total recall intentionally destabilizes us. Was any of it real? Did it happen? Does it matter? The film never fully resolved that question because uncertainty is the point. Science fiction understands that memory is not merely archival, it is experimental. Human beings live inside stories about themselves. And if those stories can be engineered, then identity itself becomes marketable. Think about how frightening that actually is. Not simply false information, curated reality, or personalized perception, or tailored emotional experiences. Memories become consumer technology. And honestly, that idea no longer feels entirely fictional. We already live inside systems designed to do the following: maximize engagement, personalize information, reinforce emotional patterns, shape attention, curate perception. Science fiction saw this coming, not because it predicted specific technology, but because it understood human vulnerability. People desperately want meaning, and systems that shape memory can shape meaning itself. In Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, asks one of the saddest questions in science fiction. What if we could erase emotional pain? Not suppress it, not heal from it, but simply delete it. That premise feels understandably immediate. Heartbreaks hurts, grief hurts, regret hurts. Who wouldn't want relief? But the film slowly reveals something profound. Pain is deeply connected to identity. The relationship between Joel and Clementine was imperfect, messy, painful, but it was also meaningful. And as Joel relives those memories during the erasure process, he realizes something devastating. He does not want to lose them, even the painful parts, because memory is not valuable only when it's pleasant. Memory gives emotional texture to existence. It teaches it teaches the following: vulnerability, wisdom, caution, compassion, self-understanding. Science fiction repeatedly warns us about futures obsessed with emotional optimization, worlds where discomfort is treated purely as malfunction, where human beings are shaped through grief, failure, loss, regret, reconciliation. And eternal sunshine quietly suggests something radical. To erase suffering entirely may also erase depth. That does not mean pain is good. It means memory matters because it preserves transformation. And this becomes especially important culturally. Society also try to erase discomfort, say historical discomfort, moral discomfort, even collective shame. But science fiction insists a future without painful memory becomes vulnerable to repetition. The giver. The giver understands something terrifying. A society that does not need constant violence if it can control memory. The world of the giver appears peaceful, stable, predictable. There's no war, no deep suffering, there's no chaos, but there's a cost. The population has virtually surrendered. They surrendered emotional depth, historical memory, individuality, and moral complexity. Only one person carries collective memory, and only one person remembers love, grief, violence, beauty, and sacrifice, which means that society itself cannot make fully informed moral choices. Well, you may ask why? Because memory creates context. Without memory, people become dependent on system to define reality for them. And that's one of the science fiction oldest warning. Authoritarian system rarely begin by destroying truth openly. They begin by controlling historical narrative. They begin by controlling emotional framing and even controlling collective memory. Because once people lose connection to the past, they become easier to direct to the present. The terrifying thing about the giver is not cruelty, it's emotional flattening. A humanity protected from pain become disconnected from meaning. And science fiction keep insisting the absence of suffering alone is not enough to create a meaningful life. Black Mirror produces memory into deeply modern territory. Digital memory, recorded memory, replayable memory, and searchable memory. Episodes in Black Mirror light the entire history of you, explores a world where people can replay experiences perfectly. At first, it sounds useful, not forgotten details, no uncertainty, no misremembering, but quickly it becomes suffocating because human beings are not designed for permanent replay. Forensic memory changes relationship. People begin obsessing, reanalyzing, distrusting, rewinding pain repeatedly. And science fiction asks an important question: what role does forgetting actually play in being human? Because memory is not perfect naturally. Humans soften memories, blur details, heal gradually, and even reconstruct emotionally. That imperfection may actually protect us, but digital systems increasingly preserve comments, images, conversation, mistakes, and even emotional reaction. And the internet already functions partly as externalized memory, which raises difficult question. Who owns memory? Who controls assets? Who decides what is preserved? Who decides what disappears? Science fiction understands that memory and power are inseparable. And once memory becomes technological infrastructural, identity becomes vulnerable to systems far larger than individuals. So, why does science fiction return to memory constantly? Because memory is tied to nearly everything human values. Without memory, love loses continuality. Without memory, grief loses context. Without memory, morality loses history. Without memory, identity loses stability. Without memory, society loses accountability. Memory preserves consequences. That matters enormously. Science fiction repeatedly warns us that civilization become dangerous when they stop remembering clearly. When comfort replaces reflection, when convenience replaces history, when distraction replaces wisdom, and maybe this is where science fiction becomes pathetic, not because it predicts gadget, but because it understands human tendencies. People naturally drift towards simplification, selective remembering, emotional convenience, and even tribal narrative. Memory requires effort. Honest remembering requires humility. And science fiction keep insisting a future disconnected from memory becomes morally unstable because people who cannot remember deeply struggle to care deeply. So, after all these stories, what conclusion does science fiction reach? Not that memory must remain perfect, but that memory must remain human, meaning reflection, emotional, contextual, connected to moral responsibility. Science fiction warns us about future where memory become manipulated, optimized, weaponized, and even outsourced entirely. Because eventually that process reshape identity itself. And maybe this is the deeper tension underneath all of those stories. Human beings want relief. We want relief from pain. We want relief from uncertainty, grief, and even guilt. But memory carries responsibility. To remember suffering is to remain accountable. To remember injustice is to resist repeating it. To remember people is to preserve their humanity. That's why forgetting is never neutral. And science fiction keep reminding us that the future is shaped not only by what we invent, but by what we choose to remember. So what happens when memory becomes belonging to us? Science fiction answer is unsettling. Identity becomes fragile. Truth becomes negotiable. meaning becomes vulnerable to systems, and humanity itself begins drifting towards something programmable. But these stories also offer a warning worth hearing. Memory is not merely storage, it is continuality, resistance, and even connection. It is how human beings preserve love, accountability, grief, dignity, history, and even wisdom. And perhaps that's why so many science fiction stories fight so hard to preserve memory. Because once memory becomes fully controlled, people become easier to shape into whatever system requires. And maybe that brings us to the next question. If technology increasingly shapes memory, identity, communication, and emotional life, then eventually we have to ask, can technology replace community itself? Not simulate it, not imitate it, but replace it. That's where we're headed next. This has been the Sci Fi Griot, a place to slow down, to reflect, and to remember carefully. If your memories could be edited, this is the reflection. If your memories could be edited, erased, or rewritten, which one would you fight hardest to keep? And what would losing them change about who you are?